Hi, everyone, and welcome to this evening's edition of How Have I Not Read This, the book club from Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group, partnering with McNally Jackson Books. We hope that if you don't already have a copy of Mrs. Dalloway, or I might suggest, because he won't himself, The Hours, that you might think about ordering copies from McNally Jackson. My name is James Meter with Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group, part of Penguin Random House. If you'll bear with me, I have just a couple housekeeping items to touch on before I introduce tonight's speakers and turn the next hour over to them. If you would like to submit questions for our speakers, and we very much hope you will, you can do so by using the Q&A module, which should be available at the bottom of your screen. You can also upvote questions by others. You can activate the Zoom chat, which should also be at the bottom of your screen, and comment along with the conversation. We suggest toggling your chat from all panelists, which is the default, to all panelists and attendees, which will make your comments available to the group and maybe bring about some polite conversation. Okay, now I'm going to ask our speakers to start their microphones. I see their cameras are already on, and come to the digital stage. And while they're getting settled, so to speak, I'd like to introduce this evening's moderator, who will then introduce the rest of the program. It gives me a lot of pleasure to introduce my colleague, Diana Secker Tesdell. Diana is an editor for Vintage Books and Everyman's Library in the Knopf Doubleday Publishing Group. She's also the editor of more than a dozen anthologies, including New York Stories, Love Stories, and Stories of Art and Artists. And I should mention of the new Vintage Classics edition of Mrs. Dalloway with an introduction by Michael Cunningham. Diana, over to you.
Thank you, James, and welcome everyone to our discussion of Virginia Woolf's groundbreaking novel, Mrs. Dalloway, which was first published in 1925. On the surface, Mrs. Dalloway is the account of a single ordinary day in the life of a fairly ordinary person named Clarissa Dalloway. And yet, as readers for nearly a century now have discovered, it is so much more than that. Whether you are coming to this novel for the first time or whether you are a longstanding fan, I hope you will enjoy listening to our two panelists talk about it today. We have with us Michael Cunningham, who is an award-winning novelist and a senior lecturer in English at Yale University. His books include The Snow Queen, A Wild Swan and Other Tales, and his novel The Hours, which was inspired by Mrs. Dalloway and which received both the Faulkner Award and the Pulitzer Prize in 1999. The Hours was later made into an acclaimed film starring Meryl Streep and Nicole Kidman, who played Virginia Woolf. More recently, Michael has written a powerful and insightful introduction for the new Vintage Classics edition of Mrs. Dalloway, and today he will be discussing the novel with Sarah McNally. Sarah is the founder and owner of the independent bookstore McNally Jackson, which now has 4 locations in New York City and is our bookselling partner for this event. Sarah and Michael, hello, and thank you so much for being here. I'm going to turn this over to you now for about half an hour of conversation, and then I will step back in for the last 20 or 25 minutes with questions from the audience, which I will be collecting as they are submitted over chat. So to start things off, I wonder if each of you could just talk a bit about what first led you to Mrs. Dalloway and what the novel meant to you then and now. Michael, do you want to start?
Sure. I read Mrs. Dalloway. Am I audible?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I read Mrs. Dalloway slightly accidentally when I was in high school. I was a not very bookish 15-year-old in Los Angeles, where I am now, as it happens, and I went to a not very rigorous public high school, but that was okay with me because I was just really preparing for my future career as a rock star, which I intended to pursue, I think, admirably, untroubled by the fact that I had no talent. I just wanted to, wear leather pants and light my hair on fire. Who doesn't? And one day I was out in the area behind the gym where we would go to smoke. Trying to look as cool as possible if you're 15 and smoking a Salem, you stole from your mother's purse. And who came striding up to also have a cigarette. But, I can only call her the pirate queen of our high school. Every school has this girl, right? And boy, this woman, this girl, she was beautiful and smart and mean, and her 20-something boyfriend picked her up in a Mustang after school every day. And I knew that I didn't have a chance with this girl, but I did want to make some impression on her. I wanted her to know that I existed. And so I just started talking. Looking up, she's 30 feet tall and wears the skins of animals she's slain. And I just start, okay, go. Think of anything. Leonard Cohen. I love Leonard Cohen. I actually think he's a greater artist than Bob Dylan. And she's kind of smoking her Marlboro, which is a much cooler cigarette than my Salem. And she kind of looks down at me from her great height and says, yeah, sure. What do you think about T.S. Eliot and Virginia Woolf? Now, I knew they were writers. I knew that wasn't the name of the rock bands I hadn't heard of, but I had not read them, and it never occurred to me that I ever would. And I don't know. I got out of it somehow. I hope I didn't try to quote from books I had never read, but I thought, okay, in order to be a more impressive person, in order to maybe impress this girl, I went to the school library, the double wide on cinder blocks where we kept the books at my school. And there was no Eliot. There's only one book by Virginia Woolf. It was Mrs. Dalloway. I was the only one who'd ever checked it out. And I took it home, and I want to say I read it. I didn't. I tried to read it. I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't tell what was going on. I couldn't find the story in it. But I wasn't so foolish or preternaturally young to fail to see the beauty and density and gravity of those sentences. I had never seen prose like that before. And I remember thinking, oh, she was doing something with language a little bit like what Jimi Hendrix does with guitar. The small body of us who insists on the parallels between Virginia Woolf and Jimi Hendrix. And I was mesmerized just by the sentences. I would just look at a sentence and think, wow, the grace and balance and beauty of this and the boldness of it. I think there are two sets of parentheses and three semicolons in this one sentence. How did she do that? How did she get from a woman watching the royal carriage go by to a gull flying overhead in one sentence? And looking back, I think it made it when I began to be a reader. I suspect that many of us, I suspect that anyone who is here tonight has a first book. Not entirely unlike a first kiss. It may not be a great book, it may not be a great kiss, but it was your first. It was the one that kind of cracked it open for you, that showed you what books could mean to you. I think I came a little late to it. I think a lot of people probably had that experience when they were kids, but that was it. That was it, because a random girl who was not impressed that I had read Mrs. Dalloway, as it turned out, because this girl from my high school, I don't even know where she is anymore, said, yeah, but what do you think about Virginia Woolf? Poof, off I went. Although it was not at all clear to me at the time, my life changed. And I've read other books since then, but Mrs. Dalloway has remained singular to me in the way that any profound first experience does. Sarah, what about you?
I've never heard that story before from you. I remember what you once told me was that Mrs. Dalloway was like you're popping your cherry, so to speak. It was like you're losing your virginity.
Same difference. Yeah.
But yeah, it's beautiful. Mine was a little different, and Michael, it involves you. I was a bookish child, like an insanely bookish child. And when I went to college, I felt guilty studying literature. It seemed too easy for me. So I studied philosophy, which I was not, I mean, my attention span is, terrible at best, terrible. So for philosophy, it was a little rough. I mean, to read philosophy properly, to actually make it work for me, because my ADD is so extreme, I used to have to read while I was walking. I would circle the block and read these impossible, read Heidegger, just horrible. So, but secretly I would read literature, and I didn't have much money, of course, I was a college student, and there was a used bookstore. I went to McGill. There was a used bookstore right by McGill, and I bought The Waves there. And I knew Virginia Woolf's name, but I had never read her. And I read The Waves, and I couldn't fucking believe it. I couldn't believe this book. But because of the language, I mean, I didn't understand the book, but the language just floored me. And then soon after, or then when your book published, when I read The Hours, I went back and for the first time read Mrs. Dalloway, which is a more obvious point of entry to Virginia Woolf than The Waves, which is sort of, as my friend Peter said, like jumping in at the deep end. And I loved it. But for the language. And then I went back and reread the book this summer, and I thought, shit, I did not understand this book at all when I was in my early 20s. It didn't resonate at all. When I read it this summer, it spoke to me as someone who's kind of coming up on Mrs. Dalloway's and Clarissa's age. And it struck me then very much as a book about middle age, and the rereading of it was quite profound. And then I read it again this week in preparation for this evening, and that sort of wiped clean the previous readings again. And this time when I read it, it was almost, it felt almost unbearably meaningful. Every character in this book is asking themselves, what is the meaning of my life? Is there a meaning to my life? Every character is walking around asking themselves that question. And it's deeper than middle age. It's deeper than language, deeper than anything. And Virginia Woolf doesn't even attempt to offer an answer in the book. So that's my 3 times through. So I came to the book first time because of you. So thank you for that.
Thank you. As it happens, Sarah and McNally Jackson have been doing a series of online seminars on books ranging from civilization and its discontents to the Magic Mountain. I'm currently enrolled myself in the Ulysses seminar, but I did very happily teach a 4-week Mrs. Dalloway seminar in the fall. And there's nothing like teaching a book to really open it up to you when you feel like you need to be prepared to talk to other people about it. You sort of find yourself, I guess, talking to yourself about it. And I think I have no idea. All of you who are here, and thank you for coming. I know the title of the series, of course, is books you've never read, but maybe feel you should have. It's maybe the greatest book. It's certainly the greatest book I can think of in which almost literally nothing happens on the surface. It's about a 50-ish London society woman who runs a few errands, meets up with the man she might have married, but toward whom she feels no enormous passion, and then gives a boring party that no one would want to go to. And the fact that Virginia Woolf took such unpromising ingredients and spun them into a great book was even more astonishing to me on that reading than it was however many times I'd read it before. I mean, I think, to me, the one of the first questions about any great work of fiction that I read is, how did they do that? How did they do that? Because unlike other art forms, all it requires is ink and paper and the words in the dictionary. And somebody took those three things that are available to all of us and wrote The Sound and the Fury, and somebody else came along and picked different words out of the same dictionary and wrote Beloved. And that's the central mystery to me, and I just sort of bow down before it. But I was also aware, Sarah, you've just read it too. I was aware of how Mrs. Dalloway for both uses the kind of outward ordinariness of this day in Clarissa's life and just threads it with mortality. It's actually in a slightly Tourette's-like moment when I was doing the seminar, I said, oh, it's really just a book about flowers and death.
Mm-hmm. It's very much
a book about flowers and death.
Yeah, and it's hard to really think about flowers without thinking about death. And there are a lot of flowers in this book. I mean, you could, if you were to pile on the flower, but there's also a lot of death in this book, and that's something that's extraordinary. Is how subtly this book takes place in the shadow of the First World War. It takes place 5 years after World War I is done, and none of the central characters in the book have lost anything in World War I of real significance. At one point, Clarissa Dalloway is looking in the window and thinks she wants to buy some gloves for her daughter, and that, oh no, I must economize, and then you remember the war. But then she's also interwoven a victim of shell shock and his wife, who are wandering the streets, who actually, when I reread it this week, they take more, I won't say screen time, they take more page time than my memory held them. I mean, I think probably a third of the book is probably this poor shell-shocked man wandering London, hearing voices, talking to the dead, his poor wife kind of trying to pull him back, his wife saying to him, look at the flowers, look. And meanwhile, we have every other character who does nothing but look. They look at the flowers, they look at the sky, they look at the people going by. And then you have this poor shell-shocked man's wife desperately trying to get him to look at the real world around him, and he's been blasted out of it. In the introduction you just wrote for this new Mrs. Dalloway, which I thought was really beautiful, you talked about how the structure of the novel is almost like characters passing batons to each other, one to another, and how it was originally called The Hours. And I have a question. I have a question. Thank you, Virginia. I have a question for you, Michael. If this book was called The Hours and not called Mrs. Dalloway, which would be possible. I mean, Mrs. Dalloway she's not actually present on the pages more than most of the other characters. How do you think you would read it differently?
Well, for one thing, I would have to have written a novel of my own called Mrs. Dalloway. Virginia Woolf changed the title. The Hours was the working title, but it didn't last long. The book she set out to write, by the way, as far as I can tell, no novelist who has ever lived has ended up writing the book they thought they were going to write. And that's a good thing. That's a life sign. The book should defeat your initial idea about it. But she was going to write a book about London after the war, in which Clarissa Dalloway would be a relatively minor figure. And at relatively early on, she thought, no, I'm not, this is not even a paraphrase. This is my imagining. This is not something she actually wrote in any of her many letters or diaries. So thank you, Virginia Woolf, and forgive me, Virginia Woolf. But I feel like she said, in essence, the London society hostess who had appeared, Mrs. Dalloway had appeared briefly in some of her other books. The London society hostess is always the eccentric secondary character. You know, it's the Maggie Smith party in Gosford Park. It's the person you don't need to pay attention to. And what if I, Virginia Woolf, girl genius, were to insist that that person had enough gravitas to be the center of a novel? What if I were to take one of the bit players, someone almost universally regarded as silly and trivial, and said, in essence, no, this person is deep and wide and broad enough, not in the literal sense, of course, to be the subject of a novel. And in so doing, I think she made it clear to us that anybody can be the subject of a novel. There is no one whose life is too small to be the center of a great book. It's just that most of us don't happen to attract the attention of a great writer.
Yeah, and the structure of the novel is so, it's extraordinary. It's almost dizzying when you stand back and try and hold it in your head. It's overwhelming. But there's a point at the end. I think I marked the page. There's a point at the end of the book where I have an old copy of, I have a very old copy of this book. It's an old one of my father's from Britain, which has an awful cover of a woman with a blanked out face, which doesn't make a ton of sense.
That's terrible. Can I come over and draw a face on her?
It's like a nice happy face, because Clarissa is happy. That is true. She's a happy woman. I didn't actually write in this, but where she talks about how Peter's talking about remembering something she said to him on the top of an omnibus when they were young. And
Peter is an old boyfriend from when she was a girl who has turned up back in London.
Right, and it's sort of an interesting structure because, a woman in the early 1900s didn't have a ton of life choices she could make. It was really, who are you going to marry? I mean, there were a limited number of choices, and she sort of gets pulled back again and again to this time of her life where she still had choices when she was in love with a woman, and she still says that the greatest moment of her life is when she kissed this woman on the lips, and she had this sort of pain in the ass wannabe writer suitor who she could have married. He loved her. He says he could never love again. He loved her so much, but he was truly a pain in the ass, truly a pain in the ass. And had she not met, I wonder what would have happened to Clarissa had she not met Richard Dalloway. There would have been another Richard Dalloway. I mean, there's sometimes things seem like choices and they're not really choices. I mean, there's a certain.
Absolutely. And I think one of the differences between a good book and a great book is that in a good book, the characters make the right or the wrong choice. In a great book, you can't tell. And they make the choices that they make. And, in some parallel dimension, there is the Mrs. Dalloway in which she married Peter Walsh. And in a parallel dimension next to that dimension is the Mrs. Dalloway in which she stayed with Sally, the young woman she kisses once as a girl. It's even, you can't really say what Clarissa's sexuality is.
And she doesn't, I mean, it does say quite clearly that she doesn't really have sex. I mean, and you can see even this woman, the woman Susie, who she kissed, goes off and clearly has tons of sex. She has 5 or 6 huge boys. She's sort of surrounded by masculinity. She's had loads of
right. Testosterone storm comes in with her. Yes.
An odd future for like a lesbian passion to end up in that with that kind of masculinity. But and Clarissa, they have but one daughter who's sort of thin like a lily. She's not like a big, huge boy. She's like a lily, or they call her a young willow or something. And then they sleep in separate beds because her heart has grown weak, and her husband doesn't want to stress her in any way, and he wants her to have her sleep, so it makes her sleep in a separate bed. And remember, she goes up and then the servants have made her sheets tight. So she lives in sort of a sexless way, and her husband doesn't mind. She doesn't. Yeah, she doesn't.
But I like to think that in that parallel dimension, that's beyond this parallel dimension, that she and Sally would have had sex all the time.
Oh yeah, I like to think that too.
You know, let's just pause for the unwritten Mrs. Dalloway, a saga of lesbian triumph, in which a young Clarissa Dalloway refuses to cooperate with the system, goes off with her friend Sally, and is having sex when she dies at the age of 95.
Right, that's beautiful. The interesting thing watching them is they've all made these choices. As Peter, this kind of wonderful, young, problematic, difficult boyfriend, has gone off to India, made one bad marriage, is about to make another kind of ridiculous, chaotic marriage with a married woman. As the woman that she loved when she was young, Susie, has gone off, married a rich man of the merchant class, a miner's son who's earned every penny he ever made and has had these 5 or 6 huge boys. And all of them are aware that as they meet again in their 50s, they're all aware that they're judging each other. They all know that the other ones think that their decisions were bad, but they're all happy. They're all happy.
I think that I'm glad you brought that up, because for anyone here who has not read Mrs. Dalloway, I hope we're not. Yes, it is about flowers and death, and it's threaded with mortality, but it's beautiful. And one of the great qualities of Virginia Woolf to me is, though she was always aware of, shall we say, the skull beneath the skin, she was also aware of the wonder and beauty and joy of being alive. Virginia Woolf, I guess she was bipolar. We don't really know exactly. You can't really psychoanalyze anyone posthumously, but she certainly fell into depths from which the word despair or depression feel a little mild. She would really just go way down and would hallucinate and try to harm herself, and it got very, very bad. And then those periods would pass, and she would emerge, and she would get back to life and back to work. And one of the reasons that I continued to love her, long since I was 15 years old, is, if a writer like Virginia, well, there is no writer like Virginia Woolf, who went to the deepest circles of hell periodically and unpredictably, if she can come back from that place and write as directly and convincingly about the sheer joy of being alive on a Tuesday in June in London, we can believe her. This is an optimism we can trust. There is nothing cheap or sentimental about Virginia Woolf's insistence on the beauty and intensity and pure joy of being alive on an ordinary day anywhere.
And sorry. Thank you, Richard. And it's been said, I don't know what you think about if she were bipolar, that the two parts of this novel do represent that within the novel.
Yeah. I mean, it's yes, it seems fairly clear that Clarissa is Woolf's. Clarissa is Persephone when she's back on the face of the earth, and Septimus Horn Smith is Persephone in Hades. I know we're here to talk about Mrs. Dalloway, but just quickly, then she went on to write another great book, To the Lighthouse, in which she wrote very directly about herself and her family. And then she was done with autobiography. And then she had exercised to whatever extent she needed to her personal demons and went on. And the rest of the books are not about her at all. But yes, this is the bifurcated Virginia in this book. The Virginia with her wits about her, and the Virginia without her wits about her.
There is some porousness. I mean, there's like Mrs. Clarissa will, at a couple of points in the book, says that it's sort of a relief to think of death being nothingness. It's sort of relaxing to her to imagine that. And then Septimus in Love's Life, even right when he's about to kill himself, he says, I love being alive, I love this. And so they're not porous, but it is.
No, and nothing is absolute. Yeah, death is the end, but it's also who isn't sometimes ready for it. Well, I can't speak for anybody else, but even mortality, maybe especially mortality, is mutable. And Clarissa and Septimus never meet in the book, though she learns about his anonymous death at the end. So they do kind of come together at the end. And this beautiful book comes to a close with life going on. With Clarissa going back to the party. More and more and more of it, even though, as Clarissa herself thinks, it's terribly dangerous to live even one day.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There's don't let me have lost this thought, but we'll come back. Oh shit.
And the one character who, even through the 3 readings I've had of this book, remains somewhat mysterious to me is her husband, is Richard Dalloway. And you're barely in, I mean, this book, it skips from mind to mind. And when you're in his mind, he thinks, I love Clarissa, I'm gonna go tell Clarissa I love her, which is very sweet, but you don't have the same chaos of sensation and thought that you get in other people's minds. And I don't know if that was deliberate on Virginia Woolf's part or not.
I don't know either, but she is so even-handed with everybody else that I feel like, in a novel, even a much less complicated one than this, you drop a stitch sometimes. And yeah, Richard is as obscure as any of the characters are, as more obscure. And you got me there. I think she just didn't get to that one. Or sometimes you find, I'm no Virginia Woolf, but I write, and there's some characters you just can't get. You can't find your way into them. And that may have happened for her with the very upright, conventional and proud of it, Richard Dalloway. But one of the reasons I think that we love a writer like Virginia Woolf and occasionally find writers slightly irritating is that, to me, the writers I love are always saying, no, it's more complicated than that.
Mm-hmm.
Whatever you think, there's more to it than that. And I really think an alternate title for Mrs. Dalloway could certainly be, but it's more complicated than that.
And the nice thing about Clarissa Dalloway as a character is she's clearly thinking that all the time too. She always says, I don't understand. I never say a person is this or a person is that. She always says, I don't understand. I forgot to see that quote of when she was on top of the omnibus with Peter when she was young. And the structure of this book is so extraordinary and so ephemeral in a way. And towards the end of it, in the last sort of 20% of it, her youthful suitor says that when she was young, she said that you can't really, would it be annoying if I read it? It's about, okay. Okay, she said she felt herself not here, and she tapped the back of the seat, but everywhere. She waved her hand going up Shaftesbury Avenue. She was all that, so that to know her or anyone, one must seek out all the people who completed them, even the places. Odd affinities she had with people she had never spoken to, some woman in the street, some man behind a counter, even trees or barns. And that's another, coming after reading this sort of baton passing, that's, yeah, it brings the book back to her.
I think I want to talk to the audience, to all you. I just want to say, just add quickly that one of the great pleasures of reading Mrs. Dalloway is, it's not her first novel. It's probably her first great novel.
Mm.
There's Jacob's Room, but really Mrs. Dalloway is when she hits her stride. And one of the pleasures to me of reading it is that it's a little like a jazz improvisation, and you can actually, if you want to turn your eye or turn your ear that way, you can almost see Virginia Woolf learning how to write a great book by writing one. Mm. It has this kind of sense of being hatched as she's writing it and as you're reading it, which makes it very alive and slightly dangerous.
Shall we start taking some questions from the audience? Okay, got several here. This one is for you, Sarah. I know you are now rereading Ulysses right now, a novel that Woolf disliked, yet both these books contend with quotidian lives as they play out on a single day, both in mid-June. Has rereading these two books side by side revealed anything to you about either or both of them?
Well, that could actually go to both of us, because Michael and I are rereading Ulysses right now. So we can both answer. It's interesting because I took a day off work this week to read Mrs. Dalloway, and then at the end of it, I picked up Ulysses, and I thought they would flow so perfectly into each other. I mean, they're both sort of stream of consciousness books written at around the same time. I thought it would sort of be a flow as an experience, and I got into Ulysses, and I felt like I was being sort of hit in the face by Joyce after reading Woolf all day. So I'm not sure. I mean, the more I reread Woolf, the more I think that she's sort of my desert island novelist. I mean, if I can't think of a book of a writer I would rather take with me to a desert island than Virginia Woolf. Ulysses it's infuriating, it's brilliant, it's funny, it's boring, it's sorry, Michael. Yeah. And but I don't know if I'd want to be stuck alone on a desert island with Joyce. I mean, I might kill the guy. Whereas with Woolf, I think I could do it. So they don't go as together as organically as I would have thought. Michael, what do you think?
Yeah, I think they were performing a similar experiment. And by the way, Woolf initially didn't like Ulysses, but she read it twice. She and Leonard started the Hogarth Press. They were one of the 1,000 people who refused to publish Ulysses, but she read it once, and she said she liked it the first time, and then the second time she found it dull. Many people find passages in Ulysses challenging or even dull, and to me, if we're going to go to that desert island together, let's just bring 2 copies of Virginia Woolf, because I feel like, as much as I admire Ulysses, and it is a great book, there's no denying it, there's a fundamental difference to me between the relationship between Joyce and the reader and Woolf and the reader. Joyce wants to dominate you. Joyce wants to just fill you with James Joyceness by way of any orifice you will make available to you. He is better read than you, and some people like that kind of relationship. Woolf, to me, is more a writer who stands beside you and says, we all know everything, but I'm going to talk to you about what we both already know, which is a very different kind of relationship. And I personally prefer that kind.
Great. Here's a question from a high school teacher who says, my current high school students interpret literature through the lens of identity, their own and that of the author. Their curiosity leads them to learn about Woolf, and they are finding stories about her being racist or anti-Semitic, mentally ill, possibly gay. To what degree do you think Woolf's own biography should be considered in a discussion of the novel?
What do you think, Stephen?
Oh, Michael, I was just sitting back and passing this to you because I know this is something that you've struggled with a little bit yourself.
It's something, you know, I teach my students and I talk about it. I hold to the notion that throughout history, terrible people have written great books. And if we start throwing out books on the basis of the politics and etc. of the people who wrote them, there goes Eliot, there goes Flannery O'Connor, there go so many writers whose books I would miss. So yeah, I feel like you know, I wish I didn't know that about you, but I can't deny that somehow your racist, misogynist, homophobic assholeness didn't infect this book.
Yeah.
It's different if the book, you know,
Right.
is racist, homophobic, misogynist. You know what I mean? But you know, I just feel like there is, as far as I can tell, no connection, no visible connection between lovely people who write great books and awful people who write great books. It's like the extraterrestrials just aim that beam of light randomly at the earth and it strikes this person and that person and that person. So there's awful Thomas Mann and gorgeous Eudora Welty, and they're both struck by the same light.
Mm-hmm. And this is not a hateful book. Lord knows when it's perhaps the least hateful book I've ever read.
But yeah, I mean, why not? She could be anti-Semitic. She was a snob. She wrote about being. Anyway, enough about that. But yeah, this is not to say those things are not at least somewhat true of her. There are worse great writers, but it's not to say it's not true. It's just to say I think we have to just get past it and look at the book.
Here's another question relating to teaching the book to students. This is a novel that's very grounded in a specific time and place. And I know when I first read the book as a teenager, the details about various London streets and neighborhoods, the subtleties of English class were completely lost on me. Less so later on. But I think for American readers in particular, a lot of the specifics of place and class can kind of go over our heads. Do you think that affects our reading of the book, or does it really not matter at all? And how do you handle that with introducing it to students?
I don't want to just talk and talk and talk. Sarah, do you have it? But I do teach.
I'm not a teacher, so I can't.
Yeah, I will then. You know, I encourage my students to make the leap into other lives and other times, because to me, one of the fundamental purposes of fiction is to promote empathy. That in that way, it's inherently political because it is the best known means, as far as I can tell, to show us viscerally what it's like to be someone other than ourselves. And although I understand the appeal of reading somebody like you, I encourage my students to think beyond that. And you know, if not now, maybe a little later on. And you can still meet the emotions. I mean, is anyone put off of Pride and Prejudice because we don't know what a 4 and 4 or a farthingale is? Not really. So yeah, I get it. Especially I think when you're young, it can be hard. Your own life is mysterious and difficult enough, and I don't shame my students for having trouble entering the way back and going to turn of the 19th century. London, but I encourage them to fasten their seatbelts and hope that they will.
And I wonder a little bit too. I mean, so when I was reading this novel this week, I was thinking of the role. I mean, when you read novels from a different century, you think of the roles that letters played, or even now the role that the telephone plays. And certainly, or in this, there's a scene with a motor car where motor cars are sort of unusual, and you realize that there's horses and horse shit all over the streets, and it's different. Walking the streets as Mrs. Dalloway is different from walking the streets now, for if only because of motor cars, but for other reasons too. And yet the horse and carriage probably fills the same psychological space that the car fills for me now. The letters and the telephone fill the same space that emails and texts do for me now. So whether you can make the leap, I mean, the snobbery, the subtleties of snobbery may not be the same in New York. And I'm sure that I don't get them even as an adult reading Mrs. Dalloway now, but certainly the feelings are relatable, just with different contexts for me. Probably for me, it would be people who didn't read, would be how Clarissa would think about people who work in the merchant class. So, same
So
feeling.
a number of questioners are curious about your novel, The Hours. One of the questions is, what do you think Virginia Woolf would think of it?
Whoa.
She was an extremely severe critic, and I do not cherish any fantasy that she would have liked the book, but I think she would have been very happy to know that she was played by Nicole Kidman in the movie. Yeah, that's it.
Here's another question for you, Michael. This person says, Michael, I just listened to your episode of the 10-Minute Writers Workshop podcast, and I'm wondering if you still agree with Joan Didion that the first sentence is the hardest to write, especially in light of the amazing first sentence of Mrs. Dalloway. How planned is your writing before and after writing your first sentence?
I kind of make it up as I go along. There's another one of those things that you'll get a different answer from just about any writer you ask. I know writers who have it all planned out before they start, and great books result from that. I find that if I know where a book is headed, the characters tend to become sort of employees of the story whose job it is to convey it to its destination. And I hope that it will go someplace you didn't expect. As Flannery O'Connor, also a racist, once said, how can there be surprises for the reader if there haven't been any for the writer? And what I think Joan Didion meant about that first sentence is it's not only hard to write, it's the writer's way of finding their way into the voice, the point, how the story is going to be told. What's its vocabulary? In what particular version of English will it speak? And I think that's the thing about the first sentence. It's not so much, should the story start in Rome or at a shopping mall in Cleveland? It could start either place. It's about the language and the method of telling.
Right. And in your introduction, you quote Virginia Woolf's original first sentence, which started with the bells, right? The bells, which I noticed on rereading recently, are woven throughout the story. The characters, wherever they are, constantly hearing the bells of London ringing the hours. And that's interesting. That was where she was planning to start. What do you think? Were the bells a device for sort of connecting her sprawling cast of characters, or?
Yeah. I mean, I think a novel this diverse and diffuse needs threads running through it, like a bridge needs cables. And in a book so concerned with mortality and also with fun and gorgeousness, what better than Big Ben tolling the hour every hour? As devices go, it's a really good one. Yeah, and that the opening line, which she didn't use, is very magisterial. It's the opening line of another book. As Joan Didion would have it, that was the opening line of a book about the aftermath of World War II. And she came fairly quickly to Mrs. Dalloway, and Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself, which is the opening line of a book that will be told that way, according to the principles of that sentence.
Okay, what else do we have? Maybe one more question. Let's see. Okay, some of these are repeating. I think there's one more. Yes, okay. To what extent is this book about the big change in the 1920s in women's roles? Her daughter on the bus thinks about getting a career, while Clarissa thinks she isn't doing anything important in giving her parties.
I mean, her daughter thinks about getting a career, but then sort of thinks, but I am quite lazy. I mean, she doesn't think about it pressingly. And that's sort of, I find that there's some interesting similarities between Clarissa and then her daughter Elizabeth. I mean, Elizabeth also sort of loves a dog and feels that all these options are open to her. And yet you see, while she's hanging out with this poor, very Christian woman, you sort of know, and Clarissa's afraid that this woman is stealing her daughter from her, and that her daughter might become sort of some mad Christian who hangs out all the time in churches. But it's sort of clear that won't happen. That in the same way that it's probably was quite clear to Clarissa's parents that she wouldn't become a lesbian, it's quite clear that Elizabeth is going to become a radical Christian. And so she's not, I don't know if Elizabeth is really interrogating in a meaningful way what she can do with her life. It seems like an idea given to her by this sort of passing mentor that she toys with for a moment. So I don't see the book about this much at all.
You know, I think an important thing to remember about Virginia Woolf is that she was one of the great early feminists. And she quite consciously decided early on that her fiction would not be about how society should be, but would be about how society is. Mm-hmm. And you know, a couple of years after Mrs. Dalloway, and which does not really look much like much progress for women has been made at all, but you know, 45 minutes later, she writes A Room of One's Own. She actually, in the way of things, she sort of vanished after her untimely death, and really was rediscovered in the 60s as a feminist writer, as a feminist essayist. And as people began reading books like Three Guineas and A Room of One's Own, which were powerful, beautifully reasoned, impassioned writing about women's rights and women's equality, I said, you know, I think she wrote novels too. and along came this. But yeah. I think Woolf very consciously divided her writing life into two parts, and it would be a terrible mistake to hold her. She was responsible for so many terrible things. She was a snob and an innocent. She was not. She was very much in the service of feminism. She was not in the way of it, even though she writes compellingly about a society wife who doesn't really question what she's doing.
And this is perhaps the least pedantic novel ever written. It's just,
yeah, right.
It's just not.
It's just not.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe the fact that my AirPods are popping out means that it's a signal that it's time to say good night.
That may be.
Yeah, you know, the universe has a way of telling you when to shut your mouth.
I so want to give the three of you the last word, but if there is no last word, I will just thank you all. Michael, Sarah, Diana, thank you for this discussion. A big special thank you to you, Sarah, for bringing McNally Jackson Books in as our book selling partner for the event. Please, everyone, if there is any Virginia Woolf or Michael Cunningham that you haven't read, either stop into McNally Jackson or order them online. And if you already own everything from Virginia Woolf and Michael Cunningham, you know, they make great gifts for your friends and families. So point being, buy books. But I don't think I need to say that to anyone.
Easter is coming up.
Please watch your email over the days ahead for announcements about our next selections in Knopf Doubleday's How Have I Not Read This book club. You can follow the club's selections online with our unadvisedly long hashtag How Have I Not Read This. If there's anything else, I don't want to cut anyone off. Michael, Sarah, Diana?
Thank you. No, this was
Thank
perfect.
you.
Thank you all. It was
So
great,
much for
great.
being here.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend, everyone.
Bye.
Right.